Night was soaked in rain. The cemetery soil was damp. The moon hung half-covered, the wind howled fiercely through the night. The dirt of one grave began to shift slowly. And from that open grave came the sound of someone breathing. Then suddenly, a scream pierced the air. "Help! I'm alive!" The scream was so loud it echoed through the entire cemetery. New Orleans' old graveyard, rain poured endlessly, while the toll of the church bell still drifted through the storm. The caretaker, whose name was George, froze at the sound. His flashlight slipped from his hands and rolled in the mud. Its beams circled over the grave. And then, again came the sound of heavy breathing, as if someone was suffocating underground. George clutched his cross and bent slowly toward the grave. How is this possible? He was buried just yesterday. From beneath the soil came sharp scratching noises. And pounding against the coffin lid. George had no choice left. He grabbed his shovel and began digging desperately. The rain fell harder, and with every flash of lightning, his pale face grew whiter. The soil was being torn away, and the screams from inside grew clearer. "I'm alive! Get me out of here!" George's hands shook with terror and urgency at once. He clawed away dirt with every frantic strike. Until finally, the wooden coffin lid lay before him. George picked up his flashlight and shone it onto the lid. It was shaking. Someone was pushing hard from within. And then, with a cracking sound, the wood began to splinter. With trembling fingers, George dug into the crack and yanked until the lid burst open. And in that moment, the sight inside made his chest tighten in horror. Inside the coffin lay a man. His face caked in mud and blood. His eyes wide open, his breath rapid and shallow. As if he had dragged himself back from the grip of death itself. George raised the beam onto his face. And his voice shook as he whispered, "Oh Lord, this was buried just yesterday. Robert Miller." The moment he spoke the name, George's body trembled. Because he had seen Robert's corpse with his own eyes just the day before. Wrapped in a shroud, lifeless, cold as stone. But now, he was alive before him. Screaming desperately, "Get me out, pull me out. I'm alive, please." George stretched out his hand toward him. But the instant he touched Robert's hand, an unnatural cold surged through his body. Like frozen fingers gripping him with inhuman strength. Robert's face crept closer. And within his eyes, there was a darkness. Not the eyes of the living. But something else, something inhuman. George's breath choked, he yanked his hand away. And stumbled backward into the mud. The storm raged, rain crashing down harder. Then Robert spilled out of the coffin. His lips moved. I was trapped inside the grave, but I wasn't dead. They buried me alive." George stared at him in disbelief. "No, Robert. I saw your body myself. Your eyes were closed. Your breath was gone." Robert's scream tore through the night. "No! I was alive, and all of you threw me into the ground." George staggered back, his foot struck against a tombstone. The flashlight fell, its beam tilting sideways. For a brief moment Robert's face was lit. And George saw blood dripping from the corner of his teeth. George's throat dried. He clutched the cross around his neck again. And muttered in terror. "This is no longer a man, this has become something else." George's breathing quickened. He lifted the flashlight again and shone it directly onto Robert's face. And the sight before him froze his blood cold. Blood streamed from Robert's mouth. Yet no wounds marked his body. His nails had grown long and black. And his eyes, no longer human. Just two dark voids, glowing even in the storm's shadows. Robert rose slowly to his feet. His legs sank into the mud, but he wrenched himself free. And stepped toward George. "You all buried me alive, and now I will take you all with me." His voice carried no trace of humanity. As though two voices spoke at once, one human and one deep, demonic echo rising from the storm. George stumbled back. His foot slipped, and he fell into the mud. The flashlight's beam spun across the crooked tombstones. And George saw more graves beginning to shift. The soil trembling, as if other bodies were clawing their way out. George screamed, raising the cross high. "Jesus, save me!" Robert froze for a heartbeat. His hollow eyes shrank back from the light. But then he shrieked and lunged at George with a single violent leap. George swung the flashlight hard into his face. Both of them crashed into the mud. Blood spilled from George's lips. Robert loomed over him, his teeth gleaming in the lightning's flash. George seized his shovel and slammed it into Robert's shoulder. Robert fell back, sinking again into the mud. But his scream echoed through the entire cemetery. And in answer, 3 more graves split open. At that very moment, the distant church bell began to toll again. Like a broken warning too late to hear. George's lips quivered. He watched in horror as 3 new hands tore through the soil. And Robert rose again to his feet. No grave will remain silent anymore. Now we all live again. Robert's scream filled the storm. As the rain poured harder still. Right before George's eyes, 3 new hands clawed out of their graves. Thin faces, drenched in mud and blood, torn flesh clinging. All shrieking in unison. "We are alive! We are alive!" George staggered back, his foot struck a tombstone and he collapsed. He swept the flashlight across the cemetery. And what he saw froze him in terror. At least 10 graves across the yard, cracking apart. Soil bursting wide, as the dead clawed their way out one after another. The air filled with a chorus of screams and gasps. As if the buried souls of the world had awakened together. Robert stepped closer, towering before George. Darkness burning in his eyes. "You didn't let me rest, now I will never let any of you rest." George raised his cross once more. But this time Robert did not retreat. Instead, he seized the cross and snapped it in 2. The pieces fell into the mud. George's lips sealed in fear. His breath caught. But then he grabbed the shovel and drove it deep into Robert's chest. Robert collapsed, thrashing in the dirt. And screamed, "I am not dead. I will never die." With that scream, the entire graveyard trembled. As if thousands beneath the earth were thrashing at once. From every grave came voices. "Help us! Help us! We are alive!" George's mind spun in terror. He grabbed the flashlight and bolted toward the cemetery gates. His feet slipping in the mud. Rain lashing his face. When he reached the gate, he saw it was locked from the inside. And the heavy iron chain had tightened on its own. George turned around in horror. And there stood Robert. Red glowing eyes, blood-soaked face. And behind him, dozens of risen corpses. All smiling together. Robert stepped closer and whispered darkly, "George, you will never be safe between the living and the dead again. Now you belong to us." George's scream ripped through the storm. And with it, the cemetery bell tolled midnight. The rain ceased. And the world drowned in silence. Robert stepped closer and whispered darkly, "George, you will never be safe between the living and the dead again. Now you belong to us." George's scream ripped through the storm. And with it, the cemetery bell tolled midnight. The rain ceased. And the world drowned in silence. George's scream echoed through the air. His hands yanked the cemetery gate's chains, but the iron only pulled itself tighter. As if the gate itself was alive. Robert stood behind him. The same darkness in his eyes, the same unholy glow. And around him stood dozens of walking corpses. each with a twisted grin. A grin no human face should wear. Robert stepped forward, his voice low and venomous. You saw me buried alive, and you said nothing. Now you will join the darkness I was condemned to. George, desperate, hurled the broken pieces of the cross at Robert. But the fragments only fell onto the dirt with the hollow sound of wet stones. Nothing happened. A sudden lightning flash split the sky. George glimpsed an old church beyond the cemetery gates. Its steeple still burning with a faint light. As if someone was inside. Summoning all his strength, George shoved Robert and his horde aside and sprinted straight for the church. The dead followed, their footsteps blending with the crunch of soil, bone, and stagnant water. A grotesque rhythm that chanted with every step. Thump, thump, sh-sh-sh-sh-sh-sh, thump. George reached the church doors. He slammed against them. They opened on their own. Inside was only darkness, except for a lone candle flickering in the corner. He stumbled in and forced the doors shut, his breath tearing through his chest. He snatched the candle, lifting it toward the nave. And what he saw made the ground vanish beneath him. Inside the church, every pew was filled with corpses. Shriveled faces, hollow eyes. All staring straight at George. Then, all at once, they screamed. We are alive! We are alive! We are alive! George staggered back, dropping the candle, collapsing in the aisle. Through the flicker, he saw a figure behind the altar. An old priest, half his face hidden in shadow. And from his lips came a voice. You were meant to come here, George. They've come for you, and I have been waiting for them. George's face drained of color. Who are you, and these bodies, what are they? The priest stepped forward slowly. And in his eyes burned the same red light Robert tarried. I am the first one this city buried alive. And these are the rest. George's lips trembled. Behind him, the doors rattled violently. Robert and his horde were battering them down. And inside, the priest spread his grin as he crept toward George. George cried out. No, no, this isn't real. But his voice only echoed hollow across the hall. Then every candle in the church snuffed out at once. Darkness swallowed everything. And in the pitch black came a whisper. Your time has come. The pounding at the doors grew louder. Wood splintered. And Robert's roar shook the church. George, open it. It doesn't matter anymore. George stumbled back, his heart ready to burst from his chest. Inside, the priest closed in, his grin deepening. The priest's bony fingers settled onto George's shoulder. And in a voice like a grave, he whispered. Son, you don't need to fight anymore. We are all one. Where they came from, you will go too. Suddenly the church doors exploded inward. Robert and the horde poured through. The hall filled with screams and ragged breathing. The pews of corpses began to rise. One by one. And now, they too moved toward George. George collapsed in the center of the nave. Squeezed his eyes shut. And screamed. Somebody, please, save me. Then the church bell tolled from the steeple. A heavy, bone-shaking clang. The horde froze for a breath. The priest shrieked in fury. Who rang the bell? It was never meant to sound again. George snapped his eyes open. Through the steeple window he saw the silhouette of a woman. Draped in white, her hair whipping in the storm. Her hands yanking the bell rope with all her strength. Robert's face twisted with rage. She's back again. George gasped. Who is she? But Robert and the priest screamed together. The woman whose body was never found. The woman's shadow fell from the steeple, descending into the nave. Her face pale, her eyes drowned in black. Her lips moving. George, they want to make you one of them. But you must run, now, this very moment. Or you will become like them. George's breath quickened. Robert and the horde stirred again. The priest bellowed. Stop her. She will reveal our secret. The woman reached out her hand toward George. Come with me, only I can lead you out of here. Terrified, George clasped her hand. And a strange light enveloped him. Robert howled. The horde shrank back. And in that instant, the whole church began to quake. Pews cracked, candles ignited on their own. And a roar rose from beneath the ground. As if all of New Orleans itself was trembling. George and the woman bolted for a hidden door in the nave. But Robert's voice thundered behind them. George, you can't escape. You are ours. The secret door burst open on its own, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling into a basement. The air was damp, cold, untouched for 100 years. George stepped down, his hand still locked in hers. But her fingers were like ice. Inhumanly cold. From above, Robert's scream echoed. The deeper you run, George, the deeper you sink. The closer you are to becoming ours. George looked back. Robert and the horde had reached the door. But just as they were about to enter, the woman unleashed a blinding flash of light. Like lightning itself. And the door slammed shut again. The basement pulsed with an eerie sound. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. George turned. An old grandfather clock leaned against the wall, its hands ticking toward midnight. George's heart dropped. This is the clock they whisper about. The one that bleeds when the bell tolls 12. And true enough, as the hand struck, the glass shattered on its own, and thick drops of blood seeped from its face, splattering across the basement floor. George staggered back. What is this? Who are you? The woman turned to him, her face slowly distorting, her white dress ripping apart, her hair matted with blood. And in a voice cold as the grave, she whispered, I am the one this cemetery never let rest. 100 years ago, they buried me alive. And I have waited for one moment only. Midnight, when I can finally drag a living soul out with me. George's lips quivered. So, you'll save me? Her smile was haunting. Save you, or take you with me, time will decide. The basement walls trembled, and Robert's roar ripped through the silence above. Georgie, the door won't hold forever. George turned. The wood was cracking apart again, the horde breaking through. The woman clutched his hand tighter. Quickly. Into the clock. It is the only path out of this cursed city. George froze. Inside the clock? That's madness. But terror twisted her face. Not madness of truth. Otherwise, they'll take you. George steeled himself and lunged for the grandfather clock. Inside, a hollow cavity stretched deeper and deeper. A passage into another world. He glanced at her once more, and she whispered only, Close your eyes and jump. Above, the door burst apart. Robert and his horde swarmed down. Darkness spread across the basement like smoke, and George hurled himself into the clock's void. The woman followed, while behind them, the horde shrieks thundered. George, you are ours. George plunged through a tunnel of darkness, surrounded only by the echo of the clock's hands. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. Then, suddenly, he hit ground. He opened his eyes and realized this was no longer New Orleans. Everything was inverted. The church hung upside down. The cemetery floated in the sky, and the heavens above were drenched in blood red. The woman in white landed beside him. Her voice hushed, yet heavy with dread. This is the shadow side, the place Robert and the rest crawl from. A world where time is frozen. And with every midnight, another soul is trapped. George's throat tightened. Then, I'm trapped too. Her eyes filled with sorrow. If you follow me, maybe you can return. If not, you'll belong to this place. From far away, screams rolled in waves. George turned. Robert and the horde had also fallen through the tunnel into the shadow side. Their eyes burned redder than ever. The priest marched ahead, his voice booming. No one escapes now, George, you are ours forever. George and the woman sprinted across a suspended bridge. Beneath it flowed a river of blood. Thousands of hands reaching upward, clawing for flesh. Robert and the horde thundered behind them, their steps shaking the bridge. George shouted, desperate. Why are you taking me? Why are you doing this? The woman stopped, tears streaming down her pale face. George, I didn't bring you here to save you. I brought you here to take my place. Only by passing my restless grave to another living soul can I be free. And now, that soul is you. George froze, his blood turned to ice. No, you're lying. Her smile was cold, merciless. Not lies, George, truth. If I hadn't lured you here, I would never be free. Now I am, and you are ours. Robert and the horde closed in. Robert's laugh cut the air. See, George, every path leads here. The shadow side claims all. George stumbled back. The bridge cracked beneath him. Below, the river surged higher. Above, the crimson sky split open. The woman released his hand, her body fading into mist, as if she were returning to the living world. Thank you, George. Now I am free. And you? George screamed. No! But the bridge gave way, and George plummeted into the river of blood. 1,000 hands seized him at once, his scream echoing into eternity. The church bell tolled once more. Midnight in New Orleans. And a new grave opened. From inside came a muffled cry. Help me. I'm still alive. George screamed as he fell into the river of blood. Thousands of hands grabbed at his body, each one as cold as ice, and every finger pulling at his soul. He shut his eyes tight and whispered one desperate prayer. Somebody, please save me, someone. Suddenly everything went silent. The hands vanished. George opened his eyes and saw he was back inside a coffin. Darkness, the suffocating smell of dirt, and above him a stone slab. His breathing turned frantic. No, this can't be. I was in the river. He pushed with all his strength against the slab, and when it cracked open slightly, a man's voice came from outside. Hey, there's a voice coming from this grave. Somebody's alive in here. George's heart froze. It was the same line he once heard spoken for Robert. The slab lifted, and a new face peered in through the shadows. A local police officer, his badge reading, Officer Miller. Behind him were 2 more men, and a camera crew who had come to New Orleans to film a documentary about the city's old cemeteries. George sat up and screamed. I'm George. Get me out of here, please. Save me. Miller looked straight at him and spoke in a low, steady voice. George, that's not possible. George Anderson was buried in this very grave 10 years ago. George's blood ran cold. No. I'm alive. Last night I was with Robert and that woman, that monster. The camera crew exchanged uneasy glances. They pulled out a file, and inside was a photograph. The photo showed George himself, and beneath his name it read, George Anderson, died, 2015, buried in New Orleans Cemetery. George's lips fell open, trembling. This is a lie. I'm still alive. And at that very moment, the church bell began to ring. It struck midnight. The ground shook violently. Screams echoed from inside the graves. And George realized he was no longer just a man. He was now part of the cursed cycle. The one that restarts in New Orleans every night at midnight. George sat at the edge of the grave. His body caked in dirt, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Officer Miller shined his flashlight on George's face and whispered slowly, Mister, if you're George, then you're already dead. You died back in 2015. The reporter from the camera crew, Lisa, raised her mic and shrieked, Oh my God, guys, we're filming a ghost right now. George glared back at her furiously. I'm not a ghost. I'm alive. Miller grabbed him by the arm and pulled him up. All right then, if you're alive, explain this. Your grave, your death certificate, your file, every piece of evidence says you're gone. George had no answer. He stammered only one thing. Last night, I was pulling Robert out of his grave, and then, that woman, that shadow side. Lisa shut off the camera. Her eyes widened in horror. Wait, did you just say you opened Robert Bishop's grave? George tried to laugh, but his voice cracked apart. Yes, and he was alive, but he wasn't human, he wasn't alone, there were others, and... A cold wind swept through the cemetery. Everyone felt the goosebumps crawl across their skin. The church bell tolled again. From the distance came a wave of screams, as if the entire cemetery cried out in unison. We're still hungry. Miller pulled his gun. Stay behind me, he barked to the crew. They pushed deeper into the cemetery. The camera was rolling again, every face drawn tight with fear. George followed behind them. But inside his chest grew a sickening certainty. He knew this time, there would be no way out. Suddenly the doors of an old mausoleum creaked open on their own. From within poured the stench of blood, and a single drop splashed out onto the stone floor. Lisa screamed. Oh my God, are you guys seeing this? The blood, it's real. The camera captured everything. Miller shone his flashlight inside. And what they saw froze their blood. Inside the mausoleum, Robert stood tall. He stared directly into the camera. His eyes now pitch black, and blood dripping from his lips. Robert smiled and said, George, you came back. The cycle never ends. Every midnight, a new soul, a new sacrifice. The camera tumbled to the ground. Lisa screamed, and George's legs locked in terror. Miller fired his gun, but the bullet passed straight through Robert's body and shattered the wall behind him. Robert didn't even flinch. He only laughed. You think I'm human? I'm nothing but a fragment of time, and time can never be killed. Then, deep inside the mausoleum, the grandfather clock began to chime. Ding. Dong. Ding. Midnight had struck. And the moment the chimes stopped, the cemetery's graves all trembled at once. Hands burst out from the earth. Red eyes gleamed in the dark. And a storm of shrieks erupted so loud it shook the whole of New Orleans. George collapsed to the ground sobbing. I'm trapped again. Why me? Why always me? Robert stepped close, leaned into his ear and whispered, Because you're the one who opened the door. And whoever tries to break the cycle becomes part of it forever. Miller and the crew screamed in terror. All around them the dead were rising in waves. And George realized, this time, either he would sacrifice himself, or the entire city of New Orleans would be swallowed by the curse. George lay in the center of the cemetery, surrounded by thousands of corpses, their faces rotted for centuries, their eyes brimming with blood. Officer Miller yelled out desperately, "Run! Head for the gate!" But the gate was sealed shut, and this time, streams of blood poured down its iron bars, as if the lifeblood of the whole city had been painted across it. Lisa kept holding the camera, panting hard. This is history, living proof of the curse." Robert glared at her, and in a single motion ripped the camera from her hands, smashing it into the dirt. "Proof? This isn't proof, this is only the beginning." George rose to his feet. No fear in his eyes now, only fury. "Robert, this ends tonight. If I'm cursed, then I'll be the one to destroy the curse." Robert laughed cruelly. "There's only one rule to the curse: whoever opened the door must give up their soul. If not, all of New Orleans will drown in this cycle." George looked back into the mausoleum. There stood the same old grandfather clock. Even after midnight, the pendulum still swung, each tick stealing away another life. He turned to Miller. "I understand now, the clock has to be destroyed. It's the anchor of the cycle." Miller shouted in panic. "No, George. If you touch it, you'll be gone forever." George smiled faintly. "I've already died once. What difference does it make if I die again?" He sprinted for the clock. Corpses clawed at him from every side, but he shoved past them with all his strength. Robert's scream thundered through the mausoleum. "George, if you destroy that clock, you won't just die, you'll be trapped in the shadow side forever." George didn't stop. With all his might, he shattered the glass and seized the pendulum with his bare hands. A thunderous explosion shook the cemetery. The corpses wailed in unison, then sank back into the soil one by one. Robert screamed in rage. "No, this can't be." His body dissolved into smoke. In his final moment, George turned to Lisa and Miller. "Let the curse die here, never open that door again." Then his body burst into a blinding red light and was pulled into the clock itself. Silence fell. The cemetery lay still. The dead returned to their graves, and the gate swung open. Miller and Lisa collapsed unconscious. When they awoke, only an open grave remained, and on its stone was carved, "George Anderson, the man who stopped the cycle." The shattered piece of camera had captured just one final thing: George's last scream, and the sound of the clock breaking. After that, even when midnight came, the cemetery stayed silent. Or maybe only for a while.